Hi, everyone. So you may have seen we put out a post, me and Toli, on Twitter about how we get to decentralized Nasdaq. And those of you who did your homework probably did the reading already. But for those of you who didn't, I'll be summarizing it and going into a little more depth on all of the details and things we need to do to achieve this ultimate mission of decentralized Nasdaq. So this isn't a new mission by any means. I think from day one, kind of the founding of Solana, it was not a project designed to kill Ethereum or anything like that. It was way more ambitious than that. It was designed to compete with the New York Stock Exchange, with the Nasdaq, with the CME, with all these centralized venues that are doing tons and tons of volume. And so one of our core kind of KPIs is, can we achieve comparable volumes, comparable spreads, all of these metrics? And this is kind of a talk about what we need to do from a technical perspective to the protocol to actually get there. So there's a few things you probably have heard of already because we have so many talented people giving talks. So one of them is we need to obviously increase bandwidth, increase the number of TPS that we can do. NASDAQ does about 70,000, Visa does about 7,400 per second. We're still kind of below Visa right now. We'd love to be at 1 million TPS, and that's one of the things the FireDancer team and Anza teams are working on. And it's actually happening. It's not just like vaporware talking. You saw Brennan's talk yesterday, that even in the relatively short term, we're looking to double CUs this year. So you saw Brennan talking about SIMD 207, which is already activated. That feature flag is already activated on mainnet. And 256 coming soon, and by the end of the year, I think Lucas from Jito posted something about the new SIMD this morning for 100 million CUs. The other thing we need to do, of course, is to get the block times down. So we're already at 400 milliseconds. You heard a talk yesterday about alpenglow, which will get our round-trip confirmation times down to about 150 milliseconds. But one thing I think we haven't talked about yet is I'd like to see us get to 20 millisecond block time. And by that, I mean not confirmation time, but tick rate. So we would have a block coming out every 20 milliseconds, but the round trip confirmation time would be more like 150 milliseconds or something like that in alpenglow. And we haven't talked a lot about how to do that, but the basic idea is that we're going to be pipelining consensus. So we're going to be doing consensus on many different blocks at the same time. And hopefully, eventually, once every 20 milliseconds, we'll be popping out a new block, or maybe not just one block, but a set of blocks from multiple concurrent leaders. And this is a simplification of what this is eventually going to look like, but one of the great things about alpenglow is it lends itself much better to pipelining like this. So I think we're going to look to do a lot more research on how can we get to async execution in the next year or so. And then after that, how can we use that asynchronous execution power to go below this kind of speed of light barrier that we've had in blockchains, which says we can't do consensus faster than 200 milliseconds because that's round trip New York City to Tokyo. So that's all work that's ongoing. But what we really need to do is look at the core metrics that we need to optimize for in order to get to decentralized Nasdaq. So how can we compete with decentralized Nasdaq? We need to offer better prices than decentralized Nasdaq, because that's the product that Nasdaq and CME and New York Stock Exchange are offering. They're offering an exchange to retail users, to uninformed traders. And if we can't offer competitive prices, then they're not going to choose us. So that's kind of a complicated proposition, but I'm going to go into a little bit how this spread is formed. So this is the only math I have on the board for you guys. I couldn't cut it out because I have a soft spot for math, but basically the spread is made up of two components. It's a balancing act between how much you make off of uninformed traders, who you know more about the price than, which is on the left in green here. So that's kind of when an uninformed trader arrives, they cross the spread and you make a little bit of money off them. And on the right-hand side is this adverse selection term. When the price moves and you have stale liquidity as a market maker on the book, you lose money. We often say that market makers pick up pennies and they lose dollars. So you pick up a lot more pennies, hopefully, than dollars you lose. But when you do lose, it can mean a lot of money, and that's a big contributor to how wide the spread can be. Here is a picture of 15 seconds of real-time data from Binance on the Solana USDT pair. And you can see that there is a major difference between how this looked at midnight and how it looked at 12:30 around noon. And if you're trading at 12:30 around noon, the price is much more volatile. And so naturally you have to widen out because those jumps can happen. Here's a look at one of those jumps and just the relative size of the jump, which is kind of this shaded region. The shaded region is kind of showing how much exposure the market makers had here. And so that phrase, like market makers pick up pennies and lose dollars, well, you can see that it's wiping out. I only have 5 levels plotted, but there's many more levels than that it's potentially wiping out here. And all of that represents a loss to the market maker that has to be made up by many, many more retail trades. So one question we might want to ask ourselves is, can we help limit those losses for market makers so that they can quote tighter? Because these occasional jumps are contributing a lot to the spread. And one thing we might want to look at is, how do centralized exchanges handle these jumps? So on centralized exchanges, this is data from a very nice Buddhist paper, which looked at some data from a exchange in London on the FTSE 100, which is like their version of the S&P 500. And they found that there's this race that happens after those jumps. And in those races, the canceling firm, so the market maker, wins the race just 13% of the time. Okay, that's not that great. Can we kind of compare it to how we are doing on Solana? So here's a picture of kind of Nasdaq or some centralized exchange. A price jump happens, the liquidity is stale, and now there's a race. A bunch of takers are competing with the maker who can get there first, and the first one who gets there wins the pot of money. Here's what it looks like on Solana. So we have kind of batching either through the Jito auction or through the scheduler implementations, where we batch up transactions and then we sort them by priority fee or Jito tip. And what that does is it makes it very difficult for the market maker to ever cancel profitably. Because even when they do win the cancel, they do so by paying more. So in this previous picture here, these races that we're talking about are settled by a difference of microseconds. And the batches here are on the order of many milliseconds, 10s or 20 milliseconds, or even more than that in many cases. And so you can imagine it's very difficult to get a cancel in on-chain in the current microstructure on Solana. So what can we do about that? Well, we probably can't get rid of batching because we're working with a blockchain. So we can't just do first come, first serve. It'd be great if we could, but we can't. So given that we're going to have to do batching, it would be nice if we could process the cancels before the takes. That would reduce the spread. And one way to do that would be to enforce it in replay. So when you receive the block, instead of replaying it in the order you got it in, you reorder the block to put the cancels before the takes. And a lot of people like to do this. For instance, Hyperliquid does this on their exchange. And you heard from Jerry from Ellipsis Labs yesterday. They're building Atlas. They're also looking to do something like this, where they are opinionated about the sequencing and they put the cancels above the takes. The problem with doing that in a setting like Solana is that we're a decentralized network. Anybody can run a validator, and there's no way that we can enforce what software they run on their validator. So what you might do if you're a profit-motivated validator and you see this app-specific sequencing going on is you might say, I didn't see any cancels. So some cancels came in, but you just ignore them. Don't put them onto the chain. And then you place your take order. So you still make the money off the take, and we lose all of the point of this whole exercise, which was to lower the spread by prioritizing cancels, because the cancel makes it onto the chain in the next block and doesn't go through in time. So the way to solve that is with multiple leaders. The problem in the single leader case is that one person decides what goes on chain. So why don't we just let there be more than one person who decides what goes on chain? And then if one guy decides to censor you, you submit to somebody else, and that person includes you, and your cancel makes it onto the chain in time, and your spreads are tighter. Okay, so that's great. It all looks great, but maybe this is a little bit too abstract. So how do we actually go about doing this on Solana? So if we have multiple proposers, the first thing you're going to ask is, like, how do we merge the blocks together? We have plenty of, like, 3 blocks up here. One way to do it, which is pretty simple, is to just take all of the transactions and then order them by priority fee before we execute them. So if 2 transactions conflict, the one with the higher priority fee goes first. Now, the problem with that is, without adding a little bit more complexity, it still reduces to the auction that we saw before, only the protocol gets to make the revenue instead of the validator, which isn't a big improvement. But if we allow the app to read the priority fee, then the app can do a bunch of conditional logic and can do things like prioritizing cancels over takes, or even more complicated and better structures are possible as well. So for example, you might say, if you submit a transaction with a priority fee above 100 microsol, then you will be rejected unless you are not a take order. So if you're a take order and you try to put too high of a priority fee, meaning you're too high in the block, we will cancel your transaction. And other transactions are allowed to go ahead, so this allows us to prioritize cancels. Now I'll talk a little bit about how to do consensus in a way that makes this happen. Here's a little review of Turbine or of Rotor. In a single layer rotor, we take the block, we shred it, we erasure code it, and then we send those little shreds to the relays, and the relays send those to the validators, and then we do consensus. So we're going to try and repurpose this erasure shredding for a multi-leader system. So we have 3 leaders here. Each of them has a block. They shred their block and erasure code it. And then they send those shreds to relays. And we think like we will set up the erasure coding here so that you have to have, say, half of the shreds before you can recover any information about the blocks. In the next step, each relay reports which shreds they have to a single consensus leader who's going to run alpenglow. That consensus leader packs the block with a bunch of those I have messages, and then sends those out to the validators, and then we do consensus on this. So what this does is it effectively hides the contents of the block until after consensus is reached, at which point we can replay the block. And this is like very good for stopping sandwiching. It's very good for auctions on chain. It's a very desirable property that you might not originally think is important, but turns out to be really important for the market structure. So that's basically the overview, and we have a paper that's coming out soon that'll be a much more in-depth version of this, but that's the basic architecture that is in the paper, is this consensus that I've just outlined. So I have about 20 seconds left. Let me just speed review what we talked about. Obviously, we need to increase bandwidth and we need to reduce latency, but we also need to be able to give applications the power to sequence their own transactions. And doing that will allow them to tighten spreads, and hopefully we can achieve decentralized Nasdaq.